Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Dr. Boni Palifka, who is an international anti corruption scholar and professor in the Department of Economics at the Tecnologico de Monterrey in Mexico. She holds a PhD in economics from University of Texas at Austin. Today, we will discuss Boni's scholarly work on anti corruption. It's a great pleasure to have you on my show, Bonnie.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
We hear the word corruption quite often in our everyday life. Why it is a global problem?
So, Transparency International defines corruption as the abuse of an entrusted power for private gain. And while there's some debate over this definition, I like it. It's broad, but I like the broadness of it because it allows us to think about not only corruption in government, but also private to private corruption.
Mhm.
And it also allows us to cover more acts of corruption than just bribery or extortion. So we can include things like nepotism and cronyism, patronage, electoral fraud, big topic coming up in the United States, right? Embezzlement or
Yeah.
misappropriation of resources, which
Mhm.
in its extreme is
Mhm.
kleptocracy, which has been
Mhm.
a hot topic over
Yeah.
the last decade. And we can also talk about things like sextortion or sexual
Mhm.
corruption,
Mhm.
where it's not money that is the
Yeah.
currency,
Yeah.
but rather it's sexual favors in
Mhm.
bribery and extortion.
Mhm.
So some of the examples that we see around us, the Trump campaign and the MAGA
Mhm.
argue that the 2020 election was stolen through
Mhm.
widespread electoral fraud, like dead
Mhm.
people voting or people who are voting in more than one state. And actual research shows that such events are a very small fraction of 1% of the votes cast in the United States.
Mhm.
But those acts may be more common in other countries. And what
Mhm.
is more common
Mhm.
even than that
Mhm.
in other countries are things like vote buying
Mhm. Yeah.
or uh, destroying ballots
Mhm.
or ballot box stuffing. That
Mhm.
does happen
Yeah.
in other countries, but not in the United States.
Mhm.
Another example, the Odebrecht scandal,
Mhm.
which involved multi-million-dollar bribes to people in governments in
Mhm.
over a dozen countries throughout Latin America and a couple
Mhm.
in Africa to win contracts and to influence laws and regulations.
Mhm.
Um, FIFA Gate, where
Yeah.
we have countries
Mhm.
representatives who
Mhm.
bribed FIFA officials so that they could be selected to host the
Mhm.
World Cup. And at the same time, we have television companies that paid bribes for exclusive national broadcasting rights
Yeah.
of the World Cup.
Yeah.
And then more generally, you see things like professors, medical
Mhm.
professionals, police officers, and border guards who
Mhm.
demand payment in money or sexual favors for
Mhm.
better grades,
Mhm.
access to health care, or
Yeah.
preferential treatment. So
Mhm.
it's a real big problem.
Mhm.
Why is it a global problem?
Mhm.
Well, it siphons off resources that
Yeah.
could be used to solve our economic, social, and environmental problems.
Yeah.
It leads to unfair and inefficient outcomes
Mhm.
in markets and other transactions, other relations.
Mhm.
It Why does it exist? Why is
Mhm.
it so hard to get rid
Mhm.
of?
Mhm.
Transparency International has been publishing the Corruption Perceptions Index
Yeah.
since the 1990s,
Uh-huh.
and still two-thirds of countries score in the lower half of that.
Mhm.
So we don't see a lot of progress
Mhm.
on the Corruption Perceptions Index or on many of the other measures of
Mhm.
corruption. Why
Mhm.
is that?
Yeah.
Partly it's because there are vested interests that
Mhm.
want to maintain corruption.
Mhm.
We often hear politicians
Mhm.
saying that it's a cultural problem, or it's just that
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
what a former president of Mexico actually said that Mexicans are just corrupt. And that's sort of like throwing up your hands and saying there's nothing
Yeah.
we can do about it. But
Yeah.
really, it's
Yeah.
also a way to normalize it. And it's in the interest of the corrupt to make other people believe that corruption is normal and necessary. It was Pradhan Bardhan who said that nothing promotes, or I'm sorry, nothing perpetuates corruption so much as exaggerated perceptions of corruption. And so, you know, the Corruption Perceptions Index has helped to bring attention to this issue, but in some ways, the way that it's been framed has also contributed to perpetuating the problem of corruption. I think we need to reframe it. So, for example, on the Global Corruption Barometer, that's also published by Transparency International, in the last edition, which is 2019 for Mexico, the data show that 34% of the respondents in Mexico had paid a bribe to one of a series of public services over the previous year. And, you know, that's a high number relative to other countries. But what if we flip the script? That also means that 66%, 2/3 of the respondents to that survey didn't have to pay a single bribe to any of the services with which they had contact. So, you know, when you hear politicians and other analysts saying, oh no, corruption is everywhere, and you can't get ahead unless you're engaged in corruption, the data just don't show that. The data show ordinary people getting through life without paying bribes. And even if you look at the data from firms, where, you know, everybody just knows that you have to pay bribes in order to open a business. In Mexico, over half of businesses say that they didn't pay a bribe over the previous year. And so, you know, if we flip that script, and instead of emphasizing how high the corruption numbers are, we actually show that the majority of people in firms aren't paying bribes, I think that would help to change people's perceptions about the normalization. So that's really, really important.
So this thing is about the framing. How do you really frame this this important topic?
Exactly. And so that normalization of corruption has contributed to the high corruption equilibrium countries, where the difference between them and the low corruption countries is whether corruption is normalized and entrenched. And if it is, then it's really difficult to overcome. Or in the low corruption countries, it's an exception. So what we also find, and another reason that it's persistent, is that most countries have passed the requisite laws, but they're not enforced. And that gets us back to those vested interests in a lot of cases.
So what brought your interest to the topic of corruption?
Okay,
I know
so
it's not easy topic, you know, that's what I'm wondering. It's sometimes make you wonder, it's pretty hard, pretty heavy subject.
It's a very exotic topic, but also very serious. So I grew up in a small town in New England in the United States, and pretty quiet, innocent life. When I was in college, I went to Venezuela as an exchange student, and after I graduated, I went back to live there for a while, sort of a gap year kind of situation. And while I was there, I needed to renew my visa. To do that, it was necessary to travel 12 hours by bus across several state lines, and there were checkpoints at each state border. And so I had to go to Caracas to renew the visa. Once I got there with a friend of mine who also had to renew her visa, we go to the immigration office, and they tell us two things. One, they need to see the original airline tickets, which of course are 12 hours away by bus. And this is before cell phones, before almost
Emails.
Before the internet. Right. So it was like impossible to do that. And it was going to take 2 weeks for us to get the visas. And meanwhile, they were going to hold on to our passport. We're like, well, we can't go back across the state borders
Yeah.
without our passports.
Yeah.
What are we going to do?
Mm.
So then out of the shadows, okay, I'm exaggerating, but a man approached us and said that he could help us and if we would go back to his office with him. So we kind of looked at each other, you know, a couple of innocent gringas, and we're like, who is this person and can we trust him? So long story short, we did trust him eventually, and he charged us twice what the official fees were. And at that time,
Okay.
I don't think we even really understood what was going on. We thought that he was offering us sort of a legal service, which is the way he framed it. And it was only later that it kind of hit me that there was this connection. And so after that, I got into graduate school, and in one of my economic history courses, it was on institutional economic history, we read one paper called Corruption by Schleifer and Vishny, the 1993 paper. And I realized, oh, wow, I can study corruption from an economic perspective. And so after that, all of my final papers were on corruption. My thesis was going to be on corruption, but I couldn't get data for I was going to study corruption in the customs administration in Mexico, and I couldn't get the data that I needed for that at the time. So I changed to a labor economics thesis. And then when I finished and defended my thesis, then I went back to corruption.
Okay. So as you said, like you are economist by training, you have bachelor, master, and doctoral degrees, all are in economics. Your teaching and research focuses on anti-corruption and economics of corruption. Can you share your interest on this topic?
So I was in graduate school in the mid 1990s, and this coincides with the big surge in research on corruption. I was in graduate school when Paulo Mauro published his econometric paper, the first econometric paper that really showed that corruption has a measurable impact on economic development. So that was happening. At the same time, Transparency International was starting to publish their data. And the World Bank decided that corruption should be a part of their mission. You know, fighting corruption should be a part of their mission. And so I really got interested at the time that this was just starting to take off. And so we, from an economic point of view, there are several aspects that we can bring to the table. For about 20 years, in fact, anti-corruption was focused on changing institutions or laws from an institutional economics perspective. That was also enjoying popularity at that time. And also on changing incentives. And that's based on the principal agent theory from microeconomics and a little bit from economic history. But economics also offers things like rational choice theory, graphical analysis, and game theory, which are really important tools that can help us understand how incentives guide our rational decisions and how changing incentives through increasing the probability of detection, the probability of punishment, and the size of the punishment can move us from choosing corruption to choosing integrity. I developed a course at the Tecnologico de Monterrey in 2004 called The Economics of Corruption. I used the first edition of Susan Rose Ackerman's classic text, Corruption in Government, Causes, Consequences, and Reform. And I was lucky enough to work with her on the second edition. So for that edition, she and I included a general model of the causes of corruption, which argues that corruption occurs at the intersection of society-wide institutions, situation-specific incentives, and personal ethics.
mm,
Now, this model
mm,
recognizes that two people facing the same institutions and incentives
mhm.
might make very different choices depending on their ethics. So this was
Okay.
incorporating something that wasn't in the previous analyses. So in other words, it matters who is put in the positions of power. And so this had been omitted from anti-corruption for decades, in part because it was viewed as Western countries imposing their morals on developing countries.
Mm,
But about a decade ago, when we were writing the book, the concept of nudging was
mm,
really popular in development circles.
yeah.
And so this idea of gently pushing people in the moral, ethical direction you want them to go. So incorporating ethics made a lot of sense, and I think it still makes a lot of sense. And I just want to mention that as an undergraduate, I was a double major.
Yeah.
So in economics and Latin American studies.
Okay.
And so my teaching and my research over the last decade or so have really come back to that multidisciplinarity that I learned to appreciate in Latin American studies.
Nice. Bonnie, your current research investigates mafiocracy. Can you share a little bit about your current research project?
Yeah. So mafiocracy is the term that we use to refer to state capture by organized crime. And we can break this down into at least three different interpretations. Sometimes it's that those in government behave like organized criminals. So, for example, see the RICO charges against Donald Trump. Sometimes it's interest groups that are acting like organized crime groups. So, like when firms collude to compete for government contracts, and they rotate who wins those contracts among themselves, and therefore capture all of the contracts. And sometimes they'll even shape the tenders that are published and design the projects that they want the government to select. So that's another type of mafiocracy. And then sometimes it's actual organized crime groups, mafia type groups, that capture the government through what in Latin America are called plata o plomo, bribe or bullet tactics, or they'll actually run for office, or they'll support candidates that are willing to work with them. And so this is the area that most interests me because I live in Mexico. That's sort of also the reason that the second edition of Corruption in Government includes a chapter on corruption and organized crime. That's when I really started to study this area. We launched the project at the International Anti-Corruption Conference in December of 2022 with Louise Shelley, Robert Rotberg, Claudia Escobar, and Judge Mark Wolf. They all presented at that panel, and we will be presenting two panels actually in the OC24 conference in October. So we're looking forward to that.
Nice. Bonnie, you are working on another research project which measures progress against corruption. Can you share your this project?
Yeah, I'm really excited and proud of this. This is a paper now that is fully written and it's under review, and we're sort of nervously waiting. But at this point, it starts with Sustainable Development Goal 16.5, which calls on countries to significantly reduce bribery and corruption in all its forms. Okay, sounds good. But nowhere does it define significantly or all its forms. And the two indicators that are currently used to measure progress on this are bribery by individuals and bribery by firms. And even for those two indicators, there's very little data available. Mostly the UNODC requires countries to report their own data. And for the most part, countries aren't doing that. So my co-authors and I decided to use publicly available data.
Okay.
And we've defined significantly. We have mapped out all its forms. We looked for, what data is available for all the forms that we expect to see.
Okay.
And we developed a multidimensional index of progress against corruption, MIPAC.
Okay.
So we're using the multidimensional methodology from the poverty literature.
Okay.
And basically counting, like, how do I love thee? Let me count the ways, right?
Okay.
How have we reduced corruption? Let us count the ways. We count the number of forms or dimensions in which each country has significantly reduced corruption.
Yeah. Okay.
We find that out of 186 countries, 137 of them improved significantly on at least one dimension between 2015 and 2022.
Okay.
And in all, there are 652 country dimensions that significantly improved. This is a strong contrast with the results out of, for example, the Corruption Perceptions Index, which shows that 12 countries improved significantly in that period of time, but 14 countries regressed significantly in the same period of time. So globally, we've been stagnating. On the MIPAC, the highest ranked countries are Latvia and Lithuania, which both improved on 13 dimensions. The dimensions most improved, I find this really encouraging, are police bribery and red tape bribery, each with 66 countries. Health services bribery with 61, and education bribery with 60. So these are areas that are often highlighted as especially problematic. So I find it encouraging that these are the areas that have most improved. And then the ones with the fewest countries improving are all kinds of corruption in legislatures, which is unsurprising because they're responsible for policing themselves, basically. And the other is military bribery, which generally is not high to begin with on most indices. So, and then we also have another version of it called MIPAC Net, which takes into account the dimensions on which a country has regressed significantly. Even with the MIPAC Net, we find more country dimensions improving than diminishing. So globally, we still see net progress against corruption. I think this is really, really important because it's frustrating for countries that are trying to make progress, and then the CPI comes out and they're still in the same place that they were, and I understand the CPI has its place and it's done a great job, but it's not the right measure for SDG 16.5. And the indices the indicators that are being used are so imperfect that I haven't been able to find a report that actually says which countries have made significant progress or the progress that they've made, because they just don't have the information. So this at least gives us something. It's imperfect, but it's much better than the current indicators, and it recognizes focused progress that doesn't show up in those other indices.
I think you raised a very important point. It's showing progress, definitely is much more encouraging. I think you mentioned about developing these indicators or these indexes. How do you really collect the data about, I understand like it's easy to collect data about states or Canada or so many European countries because they make data easily available, but there are so many countries that finding data of those places is very difficult. So how do you?
Well, so we're not using national data.
Okay.
We're using global data sets.
Okay.
So we do use the Global Corruption Barometer.
Okay.
We use the barometer series, so the Eurobarometer, Latino Barometro, Afrobarometer, etc. We have World Value Survey. We have the Business Executive Survey. So we're using these global data sets with specific questions
Yeah.
that are applied to multiple countries. So that's how we're able to put together a data set with 186 countries.
Yeah, and it's more diverse as well, as you mentioned, these different sources of your data. So
yeah, so it's a lot of it is,
Yeah.
some of it is even the same sources that the CPI is using.
Okay.
We're just using the data differently to generate a
Okay.
different kind of index.
Okay. So I see a logo on your background. You founded the Academy Against Corruption in America's conference, and you also consult various nonprofits. Can you share the work you do with these organizations?
Yeah. So the idea for the Academia Against Corruption in the Americas conference actually came out of my work for the UNODC.
Okay.
I was invited to work on some university course modules on anti-corruption. You can now find them under the GRACE initiative.
Okay.
The idea there was to make it easier for professors interested in teaching about corruption to start up a course. So everything you need to teach anti-corruption is there.
Nice.
And so at the first meeting of this group of scholars in Vienna, I was chatting with Matthew Stevenson, and we both kind of lamented the fact that there aren't a lot of events that bring together anti-corruption scholars from multiple disciplines. And that also brought to mind a comment that Louise Shelley had made at the International Anti-Corruption Conference in Panama in 2016. Matthew and I had both been there. And she said that she was really glad to see academics at that conference and not just practitioners and organizations. And she emphasized how important it is to teach about corruption. And so at the same time, a lot of the anti-corruption conferences were held, almost all of them were held in Europe, Africa, or Asia. I had a couple of small children at home, and so I was trying to limit my travel. So selfishly, I founded the ACA conference to bring corruption scholars to me. And now it's kind of become I think the most important anti-corruption conference in this hemisphere in terms of, academically. And so we've been doing this since 2018. We're planning our 7th edition to be held in March.
Okay.
And we have also just launched the ACA Forum, which is a monthly online event where scholars can present their published books or articles or working papers, and civil society organizations can present their reports. We have started a YouTube channel to publish those recordings, and eventually we'll get up the recordings that we have from previous conferences. And just really trying to get some momentum going with this. We need to register it as an organization formally, and so and it's really good to see younger scholars getting involved as well.
You are a co-author of the book Corruption and Government Causes, Consequences of Reform. You mentioned previously a little bit about this book. Perhaps can you tell us about your book a little bit in more detail, I guess?
Sure. So when I started teaching a course on corruption here at the Tecnologico de Monterrey in 2004. In 2011, I started teaching a similar course at Yale. And for both of those courses, I was using Susan's the first edition of Corruption in Government as the textbook. When I started teaching at Yale, I sent her a message. I didn't know her before that, but I sent her a message, and we got together for lunch. And so the next year I went back to Yale and taught again, and we had lunch again. And by then the head of my department had said, that textbook you're using is over 10 years old, and isn't there something more recent? It's like, you know what, there really isn't anything this good that's more recent. So I went to her and I said, have you thought about doing a second edition? And she said, no, I've got other projects going on. So another year goes by. And we have lunch again. And I said, if you're willing to let me do it, I would like to work on a second edition. And, she barely knew me, but I was lucky enough, she said yes. And
Nice.
so she was fantastic. She ended up doing a lot more work on the book than I had planned. But we worked really well together.
Yeah.
And I took a sabbatical to work on the book.
Mm.
What we did was to update it from
Mm.
the 1998 edition, the one that came out in 2016.
Yeah.
We included updates on all of the, there was just this
Mm.
explosion in the literature over that period of time. And so
Yeah.
new theories came out, new case studies,
Mm.
new
Yeah.
models from the various disciplines,
Yeah.
corruption cases, lots of new data. When the
Yeah.
first edition was written, there was
Yeah.
really very little data on
Mm.
corruption. So we included a lot of data, a lot of graphs that weren't in the first edition. But at the same time, we kept almost everything from the first edition
Mm.
because it was just so good. And even
Yeah.
the examples that referred to the Soviet Union are still relevant.
Mm.
And so it's twice as long as the first edition, and we duplicated the number of references as well. It is sort of a complete guide to corruption and anti-corruption.
Yeah.
And so part of what we included were the new chapters on organized crime and corruption. There's a chapter on corruption in post-conflict situations. But we get into the economics of corruption, the law, the legal aspects of corruption, political aspects of corruption, cultural aspects of corruption, and then how the international community can play a role and what it takes for successful anti-corruption.
Nice. Boni, what is your advice for researchers who wish to study anti-corruption?
Well, so there are a lot of new, especially young researchers who are either looking for a thesis topic or are, starting their own research agenda, having, in academia.
Yeah.
I would say that we need a lot more work on corruption and mafiocracy, my interest, at the municipal level. There's been a lot of comparative studies that focus on the national level because there is so much international data that's readily available. And because it appeals to a wide audience, right? But a lot of the corrupt acts happen actually at the municipal level, whether that's petty bureaucratic corruption, traffic cop shakedowns, corruption in procurement, or misappropriation of resources. And some countries actually provide reliable data, like Mexico, that few scholars are aware of or know how to use. And so that gives you an opportunity to get in that niche. Another area is the role of political parties and the interactions between the national and the local governments is something that I think has been less studied. I admire the work of behavioral economists and those in experimental corruption studies. I think they can help us gain further insight into why corruption happens. So I'm thinking of the work of Ben Olkin or Esther Duflo and Paul Lagunas, for example. And the other thing is there are so many new data sets that are just begging to be used. So there is this new subnational index of corruption, which could help us get at least to the state level. There is the Globalized Organized Crime Index and the OECD Index of Public Integrity, which actually has just announced a contest seeking insights from this index. So, there's just so much data out there. And that's just to name three. But there are lots and lots of data sets out there that can give us new ways to study corruption.
Nice. So I want to go back to you. Initially, you mentioned that, you are from New England. For more than 24 years, you have been now at the Tecnologico de Monterrey. Can you share your experience, which initially started as a visiting professor, I guess, but now you ended up having your full academic career with tech.
Yeah, so after changing topics because I couldn't get data on corruption,
Yeah.
I was still having trouble getting data for my new topic.
Mm.
And I decided that the best way to actually get the data was to come to Mexico and
Okay.
get contacts.
Okay.
Everything works through contacts.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to get a visiting professor position for
Okay.
1 year.
Mm.
By the end of that year,
Mm.
I had found a source of data.
Mm.
I had been offered, and I had a promise to deliver the data.
Okay.
I'd been offered a full-time position.
Mm.
I got married, and my husband was offered a full-time position here in Monterrey as well. And 3 years later, I finally got the data and was able to finish my dissertation. But by then, we were pretty much established here, and the market in the United States was terrible at that time anyway.
Yeah.
And so I finished my thesis, and then we started a family, and time just passes so quickly, you know. So for those of you just starting out, I would say don't be afraid to knock on doors. I have been so pleasantly surprised at how many doors have opened to me, starting with the tech, and then Susan Rose Ackerman, who was just so welcoming, and then how one opportunity leads to another. So Susan, I'm pretty sure, recommended me for that UNODC initiative, and then that led to book chapters that I was invited to write, and it builds. But in order for those doors to open, you do have to do quality work, because if you don't, then you won't be referred for the next opportunity. It's not just about who you know, and it's using contacts in the right way, right? Not favoritism.
Yeah. Yeah. So what is next for you, Bonnie?
What's next? Well, so we have the Academia Against Corruption in the Americas conference coming up. I mentioned the OC24 conference, where I have a couple of panels on mafiocracy. For that project, I have 3 different articles already, at least conceptually, in the pipeline. I have students working on that as well. I am supervising theses, but I'm looking for PhD theses to supervise.
Yeah.
From the MEPAC project, we're waiting to hear back on that paper, but we have another paper half written on just the MEPAC in Latin America. So progress against corruption in Latin America using the MEPAC. So all of that is sort of over the short term. In the medium term, I would like to do more research and eventually step away from teaching. So, I'm looking for opportunities for a research position at a think tank or a research center. But for the moment, I can't leave Monterrey. So remote opportunities are welcome.
Thank you for your time, Bonnie, and wish you all the best on the important work you do.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share.